So we're going to move into our last presentation of this event. And the topic for this last session is reframing the conversation around equity to bridge the early literacy gap. Driving this presentation is Neil Debassige, who is an Indigenous education consultant at the Learning Bar. Neil is going to join us online. He'll be streaming in shortly. Hi, Neil.
Good afternoon. I understand you guys are having a big storm today. I was actually supposed to be there in person. My apologies for not being able to be there. I know a lot of times it's more effective to have an in-person presentation, but COVID finally reared its ugly head up in my neck of the woods and pinned me down for the week. All right, so Ani and Bojo, welcome to this presentation. I'm glad to be here, albeit virtually. I'm going to talk a little bit about my community and really give a little bit of historical perspective in terms of First Nations education here in Ontario and across Canada, and what we are trying to do in terms of rebuilding community and that long road to doing so. And one of the things, obviously, is to introduce myself. Ani Bojo, Neil Debassige, Indigenous, Chiging Donjaba, Nadominising Donjaba, Adikdo Dem, Anishinaabe and Dao. My name is Neil Debassige. I'm from Manitoulin Island, Chiging First Nation to be exact. I'm an Anishinaabe citizen and member of the Chiging First Nation. Born and raised up here on Manitoulin Island, and I am a Caribou Clan. I know you guys have started off with a land acknowledgement this morning, but I'm going to do that as well. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territory of the First Nation people in our respective communities in which we're learning, working, and organizing today, and we pay our respects to the members past and present with honor and gratitude. Our citizens have stewarded this land throughout generations, and I am confident that we're here to work together in harmony with the best of intentions. As I mentioned, I'm coming to you from Manitoulin Island and Chiging specific. There are a number of First Nations on Manitoulin Island. So you can see the little map. The red part is basically the center of the universe. And in the center of that dot is Chiging First Nation, my home. Bruce Peninsula is to the south. And you guys are down in the big blue areas where that storm is coming in. Chiging is one of 6 First Nations on Manitoulin Island, Nadominising. So we have Debassige, Shishigwaning, Ondik, Chiging, Wequemcong, and Cheguenda. And these are all First Nation communities that belong to a bigger group called the Anishinaabe. And that's made up of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi people. For a long time, Manitoulin was referred to as Odawa Minis. A majority of the peoples here were of the Odawa Three Fire Confederacy, and there were some immigrations of Ojibwe and Potawatomi people over the last couple of 100 years. But for us, here in the winter, for the Anishinaabe people, it's a time of storytelling, and for us, we embed teachings into the stories, and it's how we communicate and teach our young people. It's how we pass that information from one generation to the next, and it's how we digest information in order to make sense of our world and our place in it. We do it through experience and through story, and we also do it through language. And one of those teachers for us is a being that goes by the name of Nanabush, and I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the stories of Nanabojo, but this character in our history is one we learned from mostly through misadventure and through wrongdoings. But many times those teachings are communicated through the ability to communicate with nature, specifically with animals and with spirits, to the point where Nanabush was also a shapeshifter in order to get his trickery done and create the stories and the learning from those stories. He was able to jump from one form to another. So much so that the time came when he had to leave, he did promise of return to continue teaching lessons and continuing in our education of our peoples. And whenever we as Anishinaabeg people greet one another, you might hear us say "ani," which is hello, but you might hear us say "bonjour," and we've been patiently waiting for Nanabush's return, and so much so that anticipation has actually worked itself right into that greeting, because our teachings are in the language, and there are lessons to be learned in that language, and it's actually a form of a question. Ani Bojo, it's a short form for Nanabojo, and we're asking by chance, hi, it's nice to meet you. Are you by chance Nanabojo, who's come back in a different form to continue those lessons? And for us, those teachings are embedded in Anishinaabemwen, in the Ojibwe language, and we hold those very near and dear, to our hearts right from the moment we meet. Now, as you all know, for First Nation people across this country, the colonization of our territories brought with it this attempt to stamp out any lessons that were connected with the land and with language, and it was done through the IRS system, which removed our children from homes and thereby removing them from their main connection to language and to the lessons that are embedded in that language, inclusive of identity and value systems and a sense of community and belonging and who we are as a people. And it's no different for my own family. Many of my family went to residential school here on the North Shore of Manitoulin. The Spanish residential school was where my family went, and my dad avoided that particular school, but was sent to another one. Not necessarily a residential school, but it was a residential Catholic school in North Bay. As my grandmother passed away, at an early age when my dad was just a child. So he spent his high school years off reserve and came home in the summers. But all of that was an attempt to eliminate the Indian and the child. That was the government policy of the day. It was an attempt to, as you guys know, put out the fire, the desire to learn. And as an elder once told me, she would ask her children when they came home, how does your fire burn today? Is it brighter, or has it been dimmed? And those attempts to do that through that colonial system lasted for 100 years or longer, and fortunately for us, and fortunately for my children, those attempts failed. And they failed because our leadership and our educators back in the 50s and 60s and 70s really decided to put a stop to it and take matters into their own hands and try and rewrite some of that historical trauma that they knew was a big part of the current schooling system then. Not only the residential schooling system, but the federal Indian day school system that replaced the Indian residential school. And they started that with a response to the white paper policy in the late 60s, whereby assimilation was just the goal, that to do away with any type of separate form of education and just assimilate First Nation learners into the bigger system at large, and those leaders put a stop to that. They decided that they were going to do something different, and they did so by taking a stand, and they mandated, they argued, and they fought for and demanded that their children had a right to education, and that there needed to be something in response to the white paper to rebut the tenets in there of assimilation. And it actually was dubbed the red paper in the early 70s. Indian control of Indian education. It was a policy paper that was put forward that started to really change the landscape of First Nations education across Canada and make way for this new tide where communities started to take back control of education from the federal government and take local control of that education. Gave rise to RCAP in 1996. Which further the UNDRIP in 2007, and leading way to the TRC in 2015, and all of those helped contribute to actually change Canadian law. And that actually happened in 2022 in June, when the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People became legislated into an act. And the UNDRIPA became law in the form of Bill C-15, and that is significant. It's very important for us across First Nation territories in Canada, because it outlines some very specific things. As you can see, the timeline here. The calls for change from the 70s up until over the last 50 years. The UNDRIPA is the one that is really starting to give First Nations the clout that they need to fight for the inequities that have been consistent throughout the last 100 years in terms of how First Nations education is approached, not only at the federal level, but at the provincial level as well. Things in the TRC, there are a number of calls to action, 9 to 12 and 62 to 66, specifically, revolve around education. But it's where leadership is really taking a look at calling on the federal government to do some specific things. One is to compare funding and publish it in terms of First Nations education, both on and off reserve, and take a look at how that affects the economy of First Nations and their contribution to the economy and to their own economies compared with non-Aboriginal people, and also taking a look at the calls to action around funding. Funding should be sufficient to close the gaps within a generation. When we look at RCAP, some of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is a 28-year achievement gap. And so how do we go about taking a look at funding mechanisms to close that gap within a generation? And these are all calls to action, but not enough to give it teeth. And so this is starting to change with UNDRIPA. And specifically Article 14, which lays out three things: that we have the right to establish and control our education systems and provide it in our own languages in a manner appropriate to our cultural methods of teaching and learning. that particularly children have the right to all levels and forms of the education of the state without discrimination, and that Indigenous people have access to an education in their own language and provided in their own cultural appropriate ways. And this for people that don't know, we're in a state of lobbying for education funding, because when we received local control of education, the federal government handed down funding but only at the first and second level. Most of it at the school level, and it didn't provide for the provision of services at second, third, and fourth level services like the province does. And when we're talking about second level services, those are things like special education and assessments and what have you. And third level types of services are board supports in terms of PD, or fourth level supports of curriculum development. None of those were provided for in those original agreements, and so First Nations now are really fighting for the expansion of that in order to meet the needs of First Nation kids. And the tenets of Article 14 are not new. They're the root of education reform across Canada, including my own community. As a matter of fact, Chiging was the first First Nation in Canada to assume that control of our system in the early 80s. And I was a student who went to the Indian Day School my entire elementary school. And that's where they really started laying down some of that foundation for change. The leadership at the time completely understood that daunting task, that the system was broken, that the battle is uphill, that the graduation rates are low, and the state of disrepair of Ojibwe language was so much so that it's a language that's on the brink of extinction and is definitely in crisis. And there was a formation of this was happening all across Canada, and so we needed some representation. And the Chiefs of Ontario was a political organization that formed, that First Nations could be a part of, and they had some responsibilities in terms of oversight, not directly because sovereignty, every First Nation is sovereign, but in terms of aggregation by numbers and talking about pushing agendas forward. The Chiefs of Ontario is one of those groups that does that on behalf of First Nations. But it creates a very complex system, especially when we're all at different states of the maturity continuum. Some of our communities are still very much dependent and are still run by the federal system. Some are independent, and some are interdependent, but it creates and paints a very dynamic picture when it comes to the 133 First Nations in Canada. And when we look, not in Canada, in Ontario, but when we look at that, of those 133, there are 76 First Nations with council-operated schools. 24 of them are K-12 schools, and 52 of those are strictly elementary. But we have many First Nations with no tuition agreements. Some have self-government agreements. Some are, being run by the federal government still, and some have they're unaffiliated, they're standalones. So the current reality of First Nations across Ontario is very robust, but the commonality between them all is that there are inadequate levels of funding in terms of support, and this can be seen in a number of areas. One is a lack of data. So and these pieces of data are hard to find. And if you look at 2010, the national First Nation graduation rate was 36% compared to the rest of Canada, which was double that. In 2017, very similar in terms of our 18 to 24-year-old population. 44% of them are graduating or have a diploma. compared to double that for non-Indigenous. And a big one, in terms of special needs identification and placement, it ranges from anywhere from 3 to 5 times the rate in provincial K-12 schools. And this is the common thread that we see in our communities across Ontario, and it's why change is needed. We need to take a look at reducing that achievement gap, and the funding discussion needs to be expanded so that it really focuses a lot around on outputs versus inputs. And I'm going to get to that, because when we look at the state of affairs, we understand that the machine is broken, that it's not going to be an easy fix, and it's not going to happen overnight. That changing political systems and changing the way education is prescribed and carried out in our First Nations is something that is going to require a very serious strategy moving forward. One that helps us understand our past, but also paints a new vision for the future of our kids. And so this is really talking about education reform, and thankfully that's not a new concept. There is a lot of work in that regard, and we adopted in Chiging the work of Rick Dufour and Eker in terms of PLCs, and the professional learning community work is something that we came to know as paradigm shift, and or what we like to call 641. And I'm just going to stop sharing there for a second, because I think the big part of this notion of 641 is the 6 characteristics of a professional learning community, the 4 key questions that need to be answered that surround the one big idea. And I think everyone can get on board with the big idea, which is really to change the fundamental purpose of schools from being places of teaching to be places of learning. And it seems subtle at first, but for, I think, everyone, I'm maybe preaching to the choir here, but everyone understands that professional learning communities is really the only way forward in education today, and taking the emphasis off of teaching removes it from teachers, and placing it on learning also emphasizes that achievement and learning is the goal for the students entrusted to our care. And so I think when we look at an example of that, we decided when we came together that we were going to make decisions that were in the best interest of students. And 15 years ago, I'm retired now, but 15 years ago or so, 17 years ago, when I'd taken over the administration position at the school, that's what we decided to do. And we started with a best example was the Balanced School Day, and we looked at the research around it, and we quickly adopted that Balanced School Day. But more importantly, we adopted the Balanced School Year. And the Balanced School Year for us was something that was very important, because we took a look at what we needed, and we needed more time. And we realized we weren't going to convince our leadership to extend the school year. That wasn't going to happen. That we weren't going to get more instructional days. But if we reorganized the time, we found that we could be more effective with it. And that's where we looked at the research around the Balanced School Year, and we ended up adopting that. And it goes away from the agricultural calendar. We started a little bit earlier in the summer. We started in the first week of August, where students had 5 weeks off. actually students had 6 weeks and teachers had 5 weeks. But we really wanted to focus around the classroom outside, right? The outdoor classroom, land-based learning, taking a look at ceremony, taking a look at conservation, taking a look at getting our students back onto the land, and while at the same time giving a more balanced rest to the school year. We were seeing it in administration in terms of our suspension rates, in terms of teacher burnout and student burnout. It was usually around every couple of months or every 8 or 9 weeks, we'd see this big spike of behavior, or we'd see a spike of teacher absences because teachers were tired. And so by doing it that way, every 8 or 9 weeks or so, we would have a week off. We'd have a week in October, a couple of weeks at Christmas. We'd have the March break, and then we'd have a May break, and then we'd have the rest of the summer. But what that allowed the community of Chaging is to really approach the education system around a more balanced lifestyle, and that was that was reflective of the medicine wheel. It allowed us to take more advantage of the summer. And doing things like outdoor education and canoe trips and river restoration and science in the outdoors, and it really started to be a better representation of who we were as a people. When we looked at, I'm just going to hop out of this again. When we looked at the 4 key questions around 641. It was something that we really had to take a look at, because this is where the lobbying for funding from our leadership really needed to come into play. And every education system needs to be able to answer those 4 key questions. The first of which is, are we clear? Are we clear about what our students need to know and demonstrate in order to meet our definition of success? And in the province, they have a provincial curriculum, but in First Nations schools, we don't, and we didn't. We didn't have money to funding to develop that, and so we ended up using the curriculum, the provincial curriculum, as a guide. But it's not enough. It doesn't cover identity. It doesn't cover the history that we want to cover. It doesn't cover, language and social studies in a way that we want to do it, or science for that matter. And so we needed to take a look at answering that key question of, are we clear in curriculum? The second key question is, are we clear in how students demonstrate their learning? Do we have clear assessment and evaluation policies when we're looking at language revitalization? How do we know that our grade 8s are fluent in Anishinaabe? Do we have a curriculum that allows us to assess that? And we need that clarification. We also need clarification around our response as educators to what happens when they don't learn it. What is our response going to be, and how do we approach special education when our students struggle? And then lastly, and last but not least, is community engagement. How are we clear in how the community privileges education, and what does that look like in our community schools? What do we want to see in terms of adult caregiver engagement, and what does that look like, and what should that look like? And then there's the PLC stuff, which I think everyone here is familiar with. Common mission, vision, values, and goals, collaboration, challenging the status quo, taking action, CQI, and being results oriented. And I'm going to talk about how, when we adopted this, and how we did it, and how it became part of the fabric of what we were doing every day. Our relationship with the Learning Bar came into play in about 10 years ago. I can't remember exactly how long ago, but it was before Confident Learners was a formal program. It was an idea based on research, and TLB was looking for a willing partner. And I literally we stumbled into each other, but I honestly think it was destiny. And I laugh because I ducked out of a presentation. I hope none of you are ducking out of this one, but I was at a conference, and I ducked out of a presentation that I didn't want to be in, and I stood outside Dr. Wilm's presentation, and I liked what I heard, and I snuck in, and that's why I say it was destiny. But they were talking about what we were already talking about, data and the need for it, and data specifically around literacy. And it didn't take us very long to understand that, we were like TLB, we were a PLC, like the previous speaker said, that they were practicing, what they were preaching, and we wanted to do the same thing in order to answer those questions and move our system forward in terms of student achievement, because we knew that that data had to be in place in order to start tracking, how we were responding to students who were not achieving how we expected them to. And so we quickly found out, that our mission and visions were similar in terms of equipping students with the tools to succeed, but we went a step further and made it very specific with our kids and our school, and our teachers were very much adamant on creating the safest environment possible that nurtured the development of the individual medicine wheels of every learner. And they felt that if they did that every day, day in and day out, that somewhere down the road, the vision of becoming the premier elementary school in the province could be realized. And they founded that on a value system that was very common, because we were monocultural for the most part, and the value system around the 7 grandfather teachings was very consistent. And those teachings are really, I think they're universal. Things, like love and respect, truth and honesty, wisdom and bravery and humility. Those are universals, and we try and incorporate all of what our children are learning into those teachings, because they're grounded and interconnected with each other in them. And so, having that conversation around creating a common mission and vision was actually the part of the next step in the PLC process, and that was the formation of these collaborative groups. And the balanced school year allowed us to do that. It bought us some time. We were able to create early dismissals every single week of the school year. It was hard to do in terms of supervision. Don't get me wrong; there were all kinds of obstacles, but we overcame them. Why? Because teachers said that the most valuable thing in their day is time, and that was something that we wanted to respect. And so, we were always piling, as administrators, we're piling things onto teachers' plates, and it was inundating them, and they were getting overloaded and overwhelmed. And so we decided to change our approach to the balanced school year that allowed us to work PD into the school day, where we did focus on Ojibwe language a couple times per month. We fed teachers, they fed themselves, they taught themselves, we brought people in. We did all kinds of these approaches for us to help relearn the Ojibwe language, and create classes for teachers. But at the same time, during those Wednesdays, we also had teacher study groups where we talked about the hot topics and pressure point items in education, and allowed teachers to speak to each other in dialogue and discourse around those topics. And then we also made time for specific PLC work. I know Karen has I didn't hear Karen's conversation or presentation, but I know she talked about the process of PLCs, and that it isn't a thing, that it's something that happens every day, day in and day out. And I agree. But we also had PLC Wednesdays that would allow this in-depth discussion divisionally about how they're planning their goals and achieving their goals. And with our primary division especially, they designed their PLC Wednesdays around student by student and skill by skill, very much like the literacy resource teacher was just discussing with the LRTs. This skill by skill discussion that really starts to change the flavor of how your staff is talking in school. And it's something that administrators, we do need to take stock of when we hear teachers in dialogue. What is the nature of that dialogue? Is it complaining about this? Is it talking about that? Or is it about student by student and skill by skill? And that takes a while to create that process and create that culture shift in terms of the PLC as a process. When it came down to our primary division, and I'm really going to hone in on this one, because they decided that, looking at the research, we were heavily into EQAO at the time, prior to the Learning Bar relationship, and DRAs and Cat 4s and whatever testing mechanism was out there. We were trying to find something that worked, but we did know one thing. We knew that the research showed us that 90% of kids that read at grade 3 by the end of grade 3 went on to graduate on time. And that was despite any socioeconomic gap. And this was important for us because we knew that 60% of our families were at or below the poverty line. We understand that the bulk of bad things that happens to kids happens, from grade 4 to grade 12, and it has a huge indicator of lack of success at graduation rate. We also know at the Assembly of First Nations, when chiefs ask, us as directors, what's happening and how do we change graduation rate, we knew that one of the answers would be to look at where our students were at the end of grade 3. And so our primary division focused their goals around looking at the research in terms of literacy, and it turned out to be right in line with what we were going to work with the Learning Bar. Teacher efficacy, that ability and belief in themselves that they can make a difference, that's not always there. It's a daunting task, especially when we're dealing with the levels of trauma that we deal with the residential school effect and intergenerational trauma, but just in general, that teachers were feeling disheartened and discouraged, and that maybe they just go with the status quo. And it took a lot of work to change that. Just because it has been the way doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And we had to come to the understanding that the only way to do that, no matter how much I wanted to, and as an administrator, like the former administrator that Carol was talking about, that is fantastic and all over the data and just cheerleader, gung ho. That if classroom practice doesn't change, student achievement won't. That is what needs to happen. And no matter how good we are as administrators or directors, we're not gonna be able to do that unless we change classroom practice. So we started to take a look during the study groups at all of these types of things, these pillars. Maximizing learning time, improving attendance, applying high yield strategies, developing collaborative practices with families and communities. You name it, we were looking at ways to include this in our teacher study groups and in our PLCs. We had critical friends framework for teacher evaluations. We had all kinds of things going on that allowed teachers just more avenues for PD in less threatening approaches. And Critical Friends was one of those ways to do that. The action orientation component of seeking out this new method of teaching literacy, this fell right into our lap with the Learning Bar and the Confident Learners, because it was already there for us. It was this pedagogical approach that made sense. It talked about the science behind the process that we didn't get to learn in teachers college. And definitely not me. I mean, I was a math science intermediate teacher. And so when I got students in grade 7 and 8, they didn't know how to read. I had no idea how to fix that. And so we needed to take this action approach to find out where those missing steps were in students' literacy pathway, and really understand what issues those missing steps can cause for a junior and intermediate learner, and take an active approach to trying to solve and seek out the answers to those questions. Understanding what quality looks like and continuously striving to improve that, having that plan and executing the plan and testing the plan and then reevaluating the next steps. That's embedded into was embedded into our literacy strategy, as was this notion of being data driven. This was something that you have to understand, that from a First Nations perspective, that data has always been used against us. It's very much a deficit and still is a deficit approach, but that's something that we're not shying away from anymore, because we need to know the data. But in years previous, data was always used against us to reduce funding. And so at the federal level. And so we were always very skeptical of collecting data, what to do with it, and then sharing that data, because it would be used against us. And so we really had to massage our approach to capturing data, taking a look at how to mine that data, what we're going to use it for in order to drive instructional change in a time-sensitive manner. Not the EQAO always served to pose the problem for us, because we would get the data, 4 or 5 months later, and we always had new fires to be putting out 5 months down the road. And so although we had the snapshot of where we were never able to dive into the data to understand what to do next. And this is where the CL and EYE came in. It allowed us to challenge our teaching practice and reevaluate our students' success, and really take a look at why students are struggling as they move from a curriculum that is designed to teach them to learn in the primary division, teach them to read, in the primary division, to then have them read to learn in the junior division. And I think that was something that was really clearly laid out for us in the literacy program. And it really helped us answer those first two questions, in terms of education systems, and it allowed us to really start putting the pieces together. We know attendance, is the biggest predictor of success. So that's something that COVID has, thrown another curveball at us over the last couple of years, because engagement is one of those things that's down. But we also know that all of those pieces have to act in concert. Changing classroom instruction, evidence-based planning, leading, with this culture shift, and really as administrators, instructional leadership. And for many new administrators, this idea of instructional leadership is new, and there's so many things to do in the administrative position. We're always putting out fires. We're always trying to figure out, to steal time, away from the office to get out and help teachers with improving achievement. And so this is where the new Confident Learner program with the coaching strategies mixed in really, really helped us, because it gave us on-site professional development, science of reading, science of assessment, gives us that background that I said that we just don't do a good enough job at in teachers college for new teachers. And the instructional leadership part, it was daunting for me at first, being a math science, phys ed teacher, and going into administrative role. but having the relationship with the Confident Learner program and the Learning Board, when they're assigned, literacy coaches and administrative coaches, really taking a look at how to go about instructional leadership in an intentional way to create data-focused teams was invaluable. And the other piece is that it's on site. And for those of you that are directors, this changed me as a director. 80% of PD that happens off-site stays off-site. It was a stat I got at the Reading for the Love of It conference a couple decades ago, right? It was kind of ironic that I was at the Reading for the Love of It conference, which was in Toronto, which was off-site, but it was still that stat. 80% of that happens away from the school stays away from the school, as great as it might be, right? And so having real-time conversations and instructional leadership in the classroom, whether it's through teacher moderations or having teacher study groups on site, whatever the case may be, that created just more bang for buck when we were looking at capacity development for our staff. The community itself, and this is a big one, is First Nation communities that are undergoing a lot of trauma. We have to remember, this was a big one. Students spend 9% of their time at school. That's it. If they are there, perfect attendance for kindergarten to grade 12, we only get them for 9%. That means 91% of the time they're somewhere else. And in our communities, and in many First Nation communities, it puts them at risk because communities are suffering themselves. We have the highest rates of opioid addiction than we've ever had. And our learners are spending 91% of their time in that environment, and we don't have control. So we have to maximize and the time we have, but we also have to create this steal back of time from the community by empowering them to be a bigger part of the school. And one of the ways we did that was by working with our 3-year-old parents. Right? Not our 3-year-old parents, our parents of our 3-year-olds. And what we did was we created these take-home projects for them and book bags and education games and word games and put on information nights that allowed them to take 15 minutes a day and do that prior to junior kindergarten every day. And it ended up buying months. It also created this relationship with the school that was more trusting, that it allowed them to feel more confident in their own skill set when we were talking about, reading lingo and all of the vernacular that we use, that's teacher talk, that they understood a lot of what was going on and what milestones they could look for in their own children prior to getting them to elementary school to get them off on a better foot. And it was invaluable because it formed this incredible partnership with our community and with our community of parents, that we started to see more people come out for our adult caregiver engagement nights, for our welcome back barbecues, for our student and parent-teacher conferences. You name it. We started to see parents take a more active role in our school, and we were buying time, but we were buying time from after school, and that was something that I found very, very important, and it helped us answer that key question of the fourth one of what does community privilege in education look like, where you are. Today a reader, tomorrow a leader. This is something that the Learning Bar promotes, and it's something that we actually saw in practice. This was something that as our confidence in our own teaching ability rose, when it came to literacy, we saw the achievement levels of students change, and once that achievement level started to skew in a positive direction, parents became more of an active player in their child's education. They took it upon themselves to find out and ask questions they didn't know the answers to, and not be embarrassed about their levels of education, or be embarrassed about them not knowing, because they figured that they could help, they could assist, and that when they went to a teacher, the teacher didn't just talk down to them. They talked in a language that they could understand, because they were informed and empowered in terms of what to look for and how they could help their child read just a little bit better, based on the teacher having more information around the science of reading and around how to assess more effectively, and what they could do to move them from one step along the literacy pathway to the next, without creating these gaps that would cause problems later. And so, that's how we took a look at our history and where we were as a community in terms of the national landscape, and how we fit the local our local need into not only our funding formula and strategy, and how we dispersed our funds within our education system, but also how we tried to use the work of Rick Dufour and Eker in terms of the professional learning communities to answer those education system key questions around the one big idea around the paradigm shift. And it was an effort and a half to do that, but one that is ultimately worthwhile. When we saw, a few short years after that, after this implementation, that our students go on to graduate from the local high school as the first ever valedictorian from our community at the provincial level, we know our plan is working, and it was a pleasure to help them along the way. I know that's the condensed version. I can't give it any faster than that, and I think I'm within the time frame to do that. I know you guys are under the gun for the big storm. I'm watching the radar right now, and I think you got about an hour left before it hits you. But it was a pleasure to be here today. Again, like I said, I was hoping to be there in person and get locked into Toronto in the snowstorm for the weekend, but I'll be up here on Manitoulin enjoying some nice weather. If there's any questions, I would entertain them. If not, the PowerPoint is going to be made available. I've sent it off. So if you have any questions, my contact information is there. I'm always happy to speak at length in that regard. But yeah, that's it.